This documentary is presented to you in the form of an audiobook. In 1848, Karl Marx declared capitalism's death sentence. What the bourgeoisie produces above all, he wrote, are its own gravediggers. Marx predicted with mathematical certainty that capitalism would collapse under the weight of its contradictions, torn apart by class warfare and economic crisis. Yet today, 175 years later, capitalism hasn't just survived. It has mutated, flourished, and conquered the globe in ways that would astonish its greatest critic. The industrial factories Marx analysed have given way to algorithms trading billions in microseconds. Workers haven't united, they compete globally. Consumers worship brands with religious devotion. What would Marx make of a world where capitalism's supposed fatal flaws became the very source of its unprecedented resilience? What would most bewilder the man who thought he had unlocked capitalism's self-destruct sequence? Marx's framework for understanding capitalism remains one of the most penetrating analytical tools ever devised. His concepts of surplus value, class struggle, and commodity fetishism continue to illuminate the inner workings of our economic system, even as that system has transformed dramatically since his time. Today, we'll examine three fundamental areas where modern economic realities would confound Marx's expectations. First, capitalism's unexpected resilience and adaptability in the face of crises that should have, by his reckoning, proven fatal. Second, the radical transformation of capital into digital and financial forms that Marx could scarcely have imagined. And third, the evolution of labour and class relations along paths that diverge significantly from his predictions. Through these three lenses, we'll confront the paradox of a theoretical framework that remains insightful even as many of its predictions have failed to materialize in the ways Marx anticipated. Marx's analysis of capitalism culminated in his theory of inevitable systemic collapse. In Volume 3 of Capital, he meticulously documented what he saw as capitalism's fundamental contradiction. The real barrier of capitalist production is capital itself. Marx identified the tendency of the rate of profit to fall as a law that would generate increasingly severe economic crises. The monopoly of capital, he wrote, becomes a fetter upon the mode of production. Centralization of the means of production and socialization of labour at last reach a point where they become incompatible with their capitalist integument. This integument is burst asunder. In Marx's view, these recurring crises would intensify until the system could no longer recover, ultimately giving way to socialism. Yet capitalism demonstrated remarkable adaptability through mechanisms Marx couldn't foresee. In the wake of the Great Depression, Keynesian economics emerged, providing governments with tools to moderate business cycles through fiscal and monetary policy. Rather than allowing crises to deepen, state intervention helped stabilize capitalism during its most vulnerable moments. This capacity for self-correction represents a fundamental challenge to Marx's expectation of capitalism's terminal crisis. The welfare state developed most extensively after World War II, further diffused class tensions by providing social safety nets that Marx never anticipated. Public education, healthcare, unemployment insurance, and retirement benefits mitigated the harshest consequences of market forces. These mechanisms blunted the very contradictions that Marx believed would sharpen to revolutionary intensity. Perhaps most surprisingly, capitalism evolved beyond the production focus Marx analysed to a consumption-oriented society. In his 1867 analysis in Capital Volume 1, Marx concentrated on exploitation occurring at the point of production. Yet modern capitalism created unprecedented consumer abundance, directly challenging Marx's immiseration thesis, which stated, "Accumulation of wealth at one pole is therefore, at the same time, accumulation of misery, agony of toil, slavery, ignorance, brutality, mental degradation at the opposite pole." While wealth inequality persists and has intensified in recent decades, the absolute standard of living for workers in advanced economies has risen dramatically. The working class gained access to consumer goods that would have seemed luxurious even to the wealthy of Marx's era. This consumer abundance has acted as a powerful stabilizing force, binding workers to the very system Marx expected them to overthrow. The emergence of mass marketing, consumer credit, and the cultivation of artificial desires created what economist John Kenneth Galbraith later called the affluent society, a system sustaining itself by manufacturing wants rather than just meeting needs. This represents capitalism's evolutionary capacity to generate new forms of value and market growth, extending far beyond the industrial capitalism Marx analysed. The creation of consumer identity through branding represents a dimension of commodity fetishism far beyond Marx's conception in Capital, where he wrote that commodities appear as independent beings endowed with life. Today, brands don't merely disguise the social relations of production, they actively create meaning and identity for consumers. People don't simply buy products, they integrate brands into their sense of self, forming attachments that Marx could scarcely have imagined. This transformation of capitalism from a production-centered to a consumption-driven system represents perhaps its most ingenious adaptation, one that has helped it weather crises that, by Marx's reckoning, should have proven fatal. Far from being destroyed by its contradictions, capitalism has repeatedly reinvented itself, demonstrating a capacity for metamorphosis that Marx's analysis, for all its brilliance, failed to anticipate. Marx's analysis centered on industrial production, where value came from labor embodied in physical commodities. Capital is dead labor, he wrote, which, vampire-like, lives only by sucking living labor. For Marx, the factory was capitalism's heart, and manufacturing its essential activity. Yet today's capitalism is dominated by financialization, where profits derive increasingly from financial channels rather than production. By 2008, global financial assets had reached over 350% of global GDP. The financial sector, which Marx treated as peripheral, now stands at capitalism's center. Complex derivatives and securities trade at volumes dwarfing the real economy, creating a system where speculative activity often overshadows productive investment. The digital economy has created entirely new forms of value extraction. In Grundrisse, Marx did note that knowledge would become a direct force of production, but he couldn't anticipate how tech platforms would commodify user data and attention. Today's digital giants extract value through what scholars call surveillance capitalism, harvesting data from seemingly free services and transforming user behavior into predictive products sold to advertisers. This creates a paradoxical situation where consumers provide the very resource that becomes the source of profit, a form of exploitation fundamentally different from wage labor. Users effectively work without compensation, generating valuable data through their online activities. Cryptocurrencies and blockchain technologies represent perhaps the ultimate abstraction of capital, value systems operating without material base or central authority. While Marx described money as the universal equivalent form in Capital Volume 1, digital currencies create purely digital scarcity divorced entirely from physical production. Most striking intangible assets, patents, algorithms, brands and networks now comprise over 90% of the S&P 500's value. Companies like Microsoft, Apple, and Amazon derive their astronomical valuations primarily from intellectual property rather than physical capital. This transformation fundamentally challenges Marx's labor theory of value, which held that the value of a commodity represents human labor in the abstract. When wealth creation occurs primarily through intangible assets, the direct connection between labor time and value, central to Marx's theory, becomes increasingly tenuous. Artificial intelligence further complicates this picture, as machines increasingly generate innovations and services traditionally requiring human labor. These revolutions in capital and value creation represent transformations so profound that they call into question whether Marx's framework, built around industrial production, can fully comprehend contemporary capitalism's contours, even as his dialectical method continues to offer valuable insights. Perhaps nowhere would Marx be more surprised than in the evolution of class structure and labor relations. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels predicted with certainty, society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other, bourgeoisie and proletariat. This binary class polarization formed the foundation of Marx's revolutionary theory. Yet rather than increased polarization, many advanced economies saw the emergence of substantial middle classes during the 20th century. The expansion of education, professional occupations and knowledge work created social strata that didn't fit neatly into Marx's binary model. While inequality has increased dramatically in recent decades, the class structure remains more complex than the stark polarization Marx envisioned, with professionals, managers, and technical workers occupying ambiguous positions within the class hierarchy. Marx saw the industrial proletariat as the revolutionary subject that would overthrow capitalism. In the Communist Manifesto, he wrote that the proletariat would become disciplined, united, organized by the very mechanism of the process of capitalist production itself. Factory work, with its concentration of laborers under one roof, would foster class consciousness and solidarity. Yet deindustrialization in advanced economies has fundamentally transformed labor markets, hollowing out the very industrial working class Marx placed at the center of his revolutionary theory. Today, service sectors dominate employment in developed economies, with industrial jobs outsourced globally. In the United States, manufacturing employment dropped from around 30% of the workforce in the 1950s to less than 10% today. Service work, often more individualized and dispersed than factory labor, has proven less conducive to traditional union organization and class solidarity. The rise of the gig economy has created what sociologists call a precariat, workers without stable employment, benefits, or clear class identity. In Capital, Marx analyzed the formal subsumption of labor under capital through wage relationships, but platform capitalism has created new forms of independent contractor relationships that obscure exploitation while maintaining control. Drivers for Uber or deliverers for DoorDash function as micro-entrepreneurs while remaining subject to algorithmic management, a form of labor relationship Marx could not have anticipated. Automation poses challenges Marx only glimpsed. In his fragment on machines in Grundrisse, Marx did anticipate automated production, noting that the worker would step to the side of the production process instead of being its chief actor. However, he couldn't foresee how digital technology would transform both manufacturing and services, creating new forms of technological unemployment while simultaneously generating new types of digital labor. Marx's prediction that machines would increasingly displace human labor has certainly proven accurate. Yet rather than leading to capitalism's collapse, automation has reshaped the labor market in complex ways, eliminating certain types of work while creating others. The current wave of artificial intelligence threatens to accelerate this process, potentially automating cognitive and creative tasks previously considered uniquely human. Perhaps most significantly, Marx's analysis focused on national economies when capitalism was still establishing itself globally. Today's transnational production networks have created a global division of labor that complicates class solidarity. As Marx wrote in the Communist Manifesto, the working men have no country. Yet nationalism and differences in economic development have created divisions among workers worldwide that have hindered the international solidarity he anticipated. The outsourcing of manufacturing to developing countries has created working classes in China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and elsewhere that more closely resemble the proletariat Marx analyzed. Meanwhile, workers in advanced economies increasingly find themselves in service, technical, or managerial positions far removed from traditional industrial labor. This global reconfiguration of class and labor has created complex, cross-cutting interests that challenge the formation of the unified working class consciousness that Marx saw as capitalism's inevitable gravedigger. What would Karl Marx make of today's capitalism? Undoubtedly, he would be startled by its longevity and adaptability. The welfare state's ability to diffuse class tensions, the emergence of consumerism as a stabilizing force, and the expansion of middle classes in advanced economies all defy his expectations of intensifying contradictions and polarization. The transformation of capital into digital and financial forms represents a level of abstraction that would challenge his framework built around industrial production. Yet Marx would also recognize elements of his analysis that remain remarkably prescient. Capitalism still generates recurring crises, as we saw in 2008. Wealth concentration has reached levels reminiscent of the Gilded Age he analyzed, with the richest 1% now owning more wealth than the bottom 90% in many developed nations. His concept of alienation resonates powerfully in our algorithm-managed workplaces, and his insight that capitalism constantly revolutionizes the means of production holds true in our era of perpetual technological disruption. Perhaps Marx's greatest insight was understanding capitalism as a dynamic, evolving system rather than a static set of institutions. As he wrote in the Communist Manifesto, constant revolutionizing of production uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation, distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. In that sense, today's capitalism might surprise Marx in its specific forms, while confirming his fundamental understanding of its restless transformative nature, continuing to create new contradictions even as it overcomes old ones. The relentless innovation that Marx identified as capitalism's essence persists, even as it takes forms he could scarcely have imagined.